Adam Schiff, called Kennedy Uneducated. Then Kennedy told this story. The New York Metropolitan Arts Hall glowed under the weight of its own elegance, its chandeliers sparkling like frozen starlight, casting a warm sheen across the charity gala. The marble floors reflected the swirl of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, each step echoing the wealth and influence that filled the room. It was a night of orchestrated harmony, a bipartisan gathering where Hollywood's glamour and Washington's power were meant to unite in celebration of voices that championed freedom. The air hummed with the clink of crystal, the murmur of polished conversation, and the faint strains of a string quartet weaving a backdrop of sophistication. Yet, beneath the surface, a current of unspoken tension waited, poised for a single spark to ignite it. Senator John Neely Kennedy stood near a refreshment table, a quiet figure amid the gala's grandeur. His simple tuxedo lacked the tailored flair of the suits around him, and his Louisiana drawl softened his words as he spoke with a cluster of elderly veterans. They shared stories of old songs, melodies that carried the weight of home through wars long past. Kennedy leaned in his eyes, crinkling with a smile, as he listened to a man with a bronze star pinned to his chest. His voice rough but warm, as he recalled a tune from a jukebox in a forgotten bar. Kennedy wasn't the polished senator tonight, not the figure of sound bites and Senate floors. He was a man at ease, sipping iced tea, asking questions that drew out laughter and memories, as if the veteran stories were the evening's true treasure. The hall buzzed with movement waiters gliding through the crowd, photographers angling for shots, and organizers whispering into earpieces to keep the night seamless. The stage, draped in deep velvet and flanked by lavish flowers, loomed at the room's heart, a focal point for the speeches to come. The guests were a mix of luminaries, a filmmaker fresh off an Oscar, a senator with a knack for headlines, a philanthropist whose name adorned hospital wings. The gala was a delicate dance of egos and agendas, every smile and handshake carrying a purpose. The program promised unity, but the air held the faint crackle of ambition, ready to shift with the slightest provocation. Then it came. A stir rippled through the crowd, a subtle wave of turned heads and hushed whispers. Adam Schiff had entered. The congressman, known for his sharp mind and commanding presence, moved with the ease of a man who owned every room he walked into. Cameras flashed, catching the glint of his cufflinks as he offered quick smiles and firm handshakes. Schiff was a star tonight, his keynote speech the evening's centerpiece, and the crowd parted to let him pass, their excitement palpable. His reputation, decades of political battles, a voice that could sway a nation preceded him, and the gala seemed to tilt in his favor, a stage set for his moment. Kennedy noticed, but he didn't stir. He stayed by the refreshment table. His posture relaxed, his focus on the veteran now describing a letter he'd written to his sweetheart from a foxhole. Kennedy's lips quirked into a half-smile, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Schiff, registering the commotion without engaging it. His calm was a choice, a quiet counterpoint to the room's rising energy. The veterans, oblivious to the shift, continued their tales, their voices a small haven of sincerity. Kennedy sipped his tea, the ice clinking softly, and murmured a question that made the old man chuckle, their conversation untouched by the gala's growing buzz. The program began, the lights dimming, as the MC, a journalist with a voice like polished oak, took the stage. She welcomed the guests, praised the cause, and introduced the theme, a tribute to those who speak truth against the odds. The crowd clapped their applause, warm but restrained, as the first speakers, a poet, an activist, a retired admiral, delivered brief, practiced remarks. The audience listened, nodding, but the energy was building toward Schiff's keynote, the moment everyone awaited. When he finally stepped to the podium, the applause was immediate, a surge of sound that filled the hall. Schiff stood tall, his suit sharp, his smile measured. He began with a nod to the veterans, earning murmurs of approval, then launched into his speech, his voice clear and commanding each word, a carefully placed stone in a path of eloquence. He spoke of freedom, of courage, of the duty to use influence for good. The crowd was captivated, their nods and soft claps punctuating his pauses. But then, midway through, Schiff's tone shifted. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I'm honored to be here," he said, his voice steady but edged with something sharper among artists' dreamers and a few outliers. The word landed like a pebble in a pond, ripples of uneasy laughter spreading. His gaze found Kennedy still by the refreshment table, his expression unchanged. "Some folks claim to serve the people," Schiff went on, his voice rising, "but they're just serving up cliches. I won't point fingers, but some skip the books and still preach like they wrote the rule book." The laughter grew tinged with discomfort, and every eye turned to Kennedy. The senator didn't react. He set his glass down, the motion slow and deliberate, and tilted his head as if weighing the words. The veteran beside him paused, frowning, but Kennedy murmured something, his hand resting briefly on the man's shoulder. The room waited hungry for a response, but Kennedy offered none. He stood calm and unmoved as Schiff pressed on. "I prefer men who've studied the world." Schiff said, his smirk widening, not just scribbled their names on it. The jab was sharp, personal, and the crowd's reaction, gasps, scattered claps only thickened the tension. Schiff chuckled, trying to smooth the moment, but the air had changed, heavy with anticipation, like the pause before thunder. The gala's unity unraveled in that instant, the night now a stage for something raw. Schiff returned to his speech, but the crowd's focus was on Kennedy, searching for a crack in his composure. They found none. He leaned down to speak to the veteran, his voice too soft to carry, and the old man nodded, smiling. Then, with a quiet nod to the group, Kennedy began walking toward the stage, his steps measured, unhurried. The crowd parted, their whispers trailing him like shadows. "Schiff!" Mid-sentence faltered, his eyes narrowing as Kennedy approached. "I wasn't done," Schiff quipped, his tone light, but strained. The room didn't laugh. They were waiting, their breath held as Kennedy reached the stage. He didn't touch the microphone, didn't glance at Schiff. He faced the audience, his hands clasped loosely, and let the silence grow. The chandeliers seemed to fade, the room's light drawn to him. Adam Kennedy said, his voice low, steady, carrying the soft cadence of his roots. "May I tell you a story?" The words were simple, but they landed with force, silencing the hall. His eyes swept the crowd, calm but piercing, and he began. "When I was a boy, I walked miles to a schoolhouse that barely stood. No lights, no heat, just a roof that leaked in the rain. But there was a teacher, Miss Clara Boone, who believed words could change your stars." His voice softened, his gaze distant. "She wasn't fancy, wore patched dresses, but she'd make us read old books, hymns, anything she had, and say, 'Speak clear, child, 'cause your voice is your power.'" The crowd was still Kennedy's story, pulling them into a world far from the gala's shine. I was a shy kid, clumsy with words. Once I botched a reading so bad the class roared. I wanted to disappear, but Miss Clara called me to her desk. She gave me a worn book of Psalms and said, "Read one verse every night out loud till you're not afraid." She didn't care about my stumbles, only my heart. He paused, his eyes finding Schiff, not with anger, but with clarity. "Adam, you called me uneducated. Maybe so. I didn't have libraries or tutors, but Miss Clara taught me a voice honest and true can move more than mountains. It can move people. The words hung simple but heavy, and the room felt the shift, not just a defense, but a reckoning. The silence in the New York Metropolitan Arts Hall was a living thing, heavy and expectant, as Senator John Neely Kennedy stood at the podium. The chandeliers above cast their golden light, but the room's focus was on him, his voice a steady anchor in the wake of Adam Schiff's stinging jab. Kennedy's first story about Miss Clara Boone and her tattered book of Psalms had shifted the gala's atmosphere, turning a moment of mockery into something sacred. The crowd, moments ago buzzing with laughter at Schiff's quip, now leaned forward, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet reverence. Kennedy's hands rested lightly on the podium, his Louisiana drawl soft but deliberate. Each word chosen with the care of a man who knew the power of a story told true. He looked out over the sea of tuxedos and gowns, his eyes finding not the elite, but the unseen, the ones whose lessons had shaped him. "Adam," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational, "you spoke of education. Let me tell you about some of the teachers I've met, not in classrooms, but in the places where life does the teaching." Kennedy paused, letting the words settle, and then began. "There's a man I met years ago back in Louisiana named Henry Tate. He was a janitor at a community center, the kind of place where kids played basketball and old folks gathered for coffee. Henry was in his 60s, maybe older, with hands so calloused they looked like they'd been carved from oak. He'd mop the floors at midnight, long after everyone else had gone home, and he'd do it with a quiet pride like he was tending a cathedral." Kennedy's voice warmed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I was a young lawyer then, working late on a case, and I'd see Henry in the halls pushing his cart, humming hymns under his breath. One night, I was frustrated, lost in a stack of papers, feeling like the world was too big to fix. Henry saw me, stopped, and leaned on his mop. 'You look like you're carrying a storm, son,' he said. I laughed, tried to brush it off, but he just looked at me steady, like he could see right through the suit and the briefcase. The audience was still their earlier restlessness replaced by a shared focus. Kennedy continued, his voice steady but rich with memory. Henry didn't have a degree. Didn't need one. He sat down across from me right there in that empty hallway and started talking. Not about law or politics, but about patience. He told me about his daughter, how she'd been born with a heart condition, how he'd worked double shifts for years to pay for her treatments. "Some days," he said, "I wanted to quit, to scream at the sky, but I learned you don't fix a broken thing by breaking yourself. You wait, you work, you trust." I listened, and something in me eased. Henry wasn't quoting philosophers or citing studies. He was teaching me what he'd lived, and that night, I walked out of that building a little wiser, a little humbler. Kennedy's eyes swept the room, not accusing, but inviting, as if asking the crowd to see what he saw. Henry Tate wasn't in the papers. He didn't have a podium or a title. But he taught me that education isn't about what you know, it's about what you do with it. And he wasn't the only one. He shifted slightly, his hands clasping together, and launched into another story. There was a nurse I met in a hospital in Baton Rouge years later when I was visiting a friend who'd been in an accident. Her name was Evelyn, and she worked the night shift on the ICU floor. She moved like she was made of steel and grace, checking charts, adjusting IVs, all while talking to patients like they were family. I watched her sit with a man who was scared alone waiting for surgery. She held his hand, told him stories about her grandkids, made him laugh when he thought he couldn't. I asked her later how she did it, how she carried all that pain without buckling. She smiled, tired but real, and said, "You don't carry it, Senator. You share it. That's what keeps you going." The room was quiet, the clink of glasses and rustle of dresses long forgotten. Kennedy's voice grew softer, almost confiding. Evelyn didn't have a fancy degree. She'd gone to a local nursing school, worked her way up, and spent 30 years on her feet, saving lives one small moment at a time. But she taught me something I've carried into every tough vote, every long debate. Compassion isn't learned in a lecture hall. It's forged in the moments when you choose to show up, even when it hurts. He paused, letting the words linger, and the audience stirred slightly, a few heads nodding, as if recognizing the truth in what he said. Kennedy's gaze shifted, finding Adam Schiff at the edge of the stage. Schiff stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but the earlier smirk was gone. Kennedy didn't linger on him. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. And then there was a man I met outside a VA hospital, a veteran named Amos. I was waiting on a bench, the kind of cold that cuts through your coat, and Amos sat down beside me. He was old, his coat torn, his face lined like a map of hard years. In his lap, he held a book, the cover so worn I couldn't read the title. I asked him what he was reading, half expecting him to shrug me off. But he smiled, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask, and said, "This is Aristotle's Senator. Man's been talking about virtue since before we had roads." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd, but Kennedy didn't smile. His voice stayed steady, reverent. I was stunned. Here was a man who looked like he'd been forgotten by the world, reading philosophy on a splintered bench. I asked him where he'd studied, and he laughed a deep, rumbling sound. "Studied," he said. "I fought a war, came home, and found out the library was free. You don't need a campus to learn just hunger and a light." He told me how he'd spent years borrowing books, teaching himself everything from history to ethics, because he believed knowledge was his way of staying free. Amos quoted lines from memory, weaving them into stories about his platoon, his losses, his faith. In 10 minutes, he gave me more wisdom than most of the debates I've sat through in Congress. Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the podium again, his voice a blend of warmth and conviction. Amos didn't have a diploma. Didn't need one. He carried his education in his mind, in his heart. And he shared it with a stranger on a cold night, because that's what the truly educated do. They give what they've got. Henry. Evelyn Amos. They weren't famous, weren't celebrated. They were the kind of people you pass by without a second glance. The ones who keep the world turning while the spotlight shines somewhere else. But they were my teachers, and they showed me that education isn't about where you start. It's about what you seek and what you share. The hall was silent again, but it was a different silence now, less tense, more reflective. Kennedy's stories had painted a picture not of himself, but of the people who'd shaped him, the ones whose names would never grace a gala program. He looked out at the audience, his eyes moving from face to face as if searching for understanding. "You see," he said, his voice softening, "we've got this idea that education comes with a seal, a signature, a stage. But I've learned more from the people who never had those things than I ever could from a textbook. Henry taught me patience when I wanted to fight. Evelyn taught me compassion when I wanted to turn away. Amos taught me hunger when I thought I knew enough. And they didn't do it for applause. They did it because that's who they were." Kennedy's gaze flicked briefly to Schiff, not with malice, but with a quiet challenge. "Adam, you called me uneducated. That's fine. I don't claim to know the world the way some do, but I know the people in it, the ones who work, who hurt, who hope. And they've taught me that education isn't about standing above others. It's about standing beside them, listening, learning, lifting where you can." He paused, letting the words sink in, and the crowd stirred again, a few murmurs of agreement breaking the stillness. The senator took a slow breath, his hands steady on the podium. "I could tell you more stories," he said, "about the mechanic who taught me integrity, the farmer who taught me resilience. But the point isn't the stories themselves. It's what they carry, a truth we've forgotten in all our rush for titles and trophies. The real teachers aren't always the ones with letters after their names. Sometimes they're the ones with dirt under their nails, or a book in their lap, or a hand outstretched when you've lost your way." He looked out at the audience, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And if we can't see that, then maybe we're the ones who need to go back to school." The room held its breath, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over the gala like a quiet tide. Schiff stood motionless, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that spoke of reconsideration. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals, but a single entity bound by the stories they'd heard, the truths they'd felt. Kennedy didn't move, didn't break the moment with a flourish. He simply stood there, his presence a testament to the people he'd honored, and the hall waited, knowing the story was far from over. The New York Metropolitan Arts Hall seemed to hold its breath as Senator John Neely Kennedy stood at the podium, his voice a steady thread weaving through the silence. The gala, once a glittering spectacle of clinking glasses and murmured ambitions, had transformed into something rawer, more human. Kennedy's stories, first of Miss Clara Boone, then of the unsung teachers like Henry, the janitor, Evelyn, the nurse, and Amos, the veteran, had stripped away the evening's polish, leaving only truth in their wake. Adam Schiff's earlier jab, calling Kennedy uneducated, now felt like a distant misstep overshadowed by the senator's quiet conviction. The crowd, a tapestry of tuxedos and gowns, sat riveted, their earlier amusement replaced by a shared reverence. Kennedy's hands rested lightly on the podium, his Louisiana drawl carrying a warmth that belied the weight of his words. He looked out over the audience, his eyes not seeking applause but understanding, and began his next story. "Adam," he said, his tone steady, almost gentle, "you spoke of education as if it's something you collect. Let me tell you about a moment that taught me it's something you live." Kennedy paused, letting the room settle, and then leaned forward slightly, his voice rich with memory. "Some years back, I was in a Senate hearing room, one of those places where the air feels heavy with procedure and posturing, the kind of room where every senator has a speech ready and the microphones are always on. But this wasn't about tax codes or trade deals. It was about a woman named Lorraine Carter, a mother from a small town in Louisiana who'd lost her son in a car accident. Not the kind of story that makes headlines, no famous names, no viral videos, just a tragedy that broke a family and left a community grieving." His voice softened, his eyes narrowing as if he could still see her face. Lorraine wasn't a politician, wasn't a lawyer. She was a part-time school bus driver raising 3 kids on her own with a high school diploma and a heart that carried more pain than most of us could imagine. But she'd written to every senator on that committee asking for a chance to speak. Not for pity, but for change. The audience leaned in the rustle of their movements, fading into silence. Kennedy continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I'll be honest, those hearings can feel like theater sometimes. You sit there, listen to experts with charts and credentials, and you nod like you're supposed to. But when Lorraine walked in, something shifted. She didn't have a polished suit or a prepared script. She wore a simple blue dress, a little frayed at the hem, and carried a small photo in a plastic frame, the kind you'd find at a dollar store. Her hands shook as she set it on the table, but her eyes were steady, like she'd made peace with her grief, just to be there. She looked at us 6 senators, a few aides, a handful of reporters, and started talking about her son, Marcus. He was 19, loved basketball, worked at a hardware store to save for college. One night, a drunk driver ran a red light, and Marcus was gone. Kennedy's voice caught just for a moment, and he took a slow breath. Lorraine didn't talk about blame. She didn't ask for revenge. She talked about the road where it happened, a stretch of highway with no lights, no signs, known for accidents but never fixed. She'd done her homework, not with a degree, but with a mother's resolve. She'd found reports, talked to neighbors, even tracked down crash data from the state. And she stood there in front of a room full of people with titles and degrees and asked us to pass a bill for better road safety, more lights, clearer signs, stricter penalties. Not for her son, she said, because it was too late for him, but for the kids still driving home at night. He paused, his hands tightening briefly on the podium. I've heard a lot of speeches in my time, but I've never heard anything like that. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about saving lives. The hall was still, the chandeliers above casting soft shadows that seemed to frame Kennedy's words. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze moving from face to face. Now you'd think a room full of senators would have been ready to act right. A mother's story, a clear problem, a practical fix. But the truth is that Bill had been stalled for months. Too many priorities, too many egos. I was one of the few who showed up that day, and even I wasn't sure we could move the needle. Lorraine didn't have a lobbyist, didn't have a PAC. She had a photo of her son worn around the edges, taped where it had torn. She set it on the podium like it was her only evidence and said, "This is Marcus. He deserved better, we all do." And then she sat down, her hands folded, waiting for us to decide if her pain was worth our time. Kennedy's voice grew quieter, but it carried a weight that filled the room. I don't know what it was about that moment, the way she said his name, the way the photo caught the light, but it broke something open in me. I stood up, not with a speech I'd planned, but with words I didn't know I had. I told her, "Ma'am, I don't know what the experts would say, but I know what my heart says. We owe you this." And then I turned to the other senators and said, "If we can't do this for her, what are we even here for?" He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm not saying it was poetry, but it was honest. And something happened in that room. Heads nodded, pens moved, and by the end of the week that bill was on the fast track. Not because of me, but because Lorraine Carter showed us what courage looks like. The audience stirred, a soft murmur of agreement rippling through the crowd. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. Lorraine didn't have a college degree. She didn't know the rules of a Senate hearing or the jargon we throw around to sound smart. But she had something more, an education born of loss of love, of showing up when the world told her to stay home. And she taught me something I've carried ever since: the most powerful voices aren't always the loudest or the most polished. Sometimes they're the ones that tremble but keep speaking anyway. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes searching for connection. That day I learned that education isn't about how many facts you can cite, or how well you can argue. It's about what you do when the moment comes, when someone's counting on you to listen, to act, to care. Kennedy's gaze shifted briefly to Adam Schiff, who stood at the edge of the stage, his arms still crossed, his face a mask of guarded attention. The senator didn't linger on him. Instead, he turned back to the audience, his voice softening, almost confiding. "I think about Lorraine a lot, especially when I'm in rooms like this where the lights are bright and the stakes feel abstract. She reminded me that the work we do, whether it's in a Senate chamber or a community center, isn't about us. It's about the people who trust us to see them, to hear them. And that's not something you learn in a seminar or a study group. It's something you learn when you're faced with a truth you can't ignore." He paused, letting the words settle, and the room seemed to exhale the tension, easing into something warmer, more reflective. Kennedy's hands rested lightly on the podium, his posture relaxed, but purposeful. Lorraine's bill passed not with fanfare, but with a quiet resolve that felt right. I went back to that town a year later, saw the new lights on that highway, the signs that might have saved her son. And I saw Lorraine still driving her bus, still carrying that photo in her purse. She didn't thank me, didn't need to. She just said, "Keep listening, Senator. That's all they ask." And I've tried to every day since. His voice grew quieter, but it carried a conviction that filled the hall. "That's what education means to me, Adam. Not a certificate on the wall, but a promise to keep learning from the people who've got no reason to trust you, but do anyway." The crowd was motionless, their earlier restlessness replaced by a shared stillness. Kennedy looked out over the audience, his eyes moving from face to face, as if inviting them to see Lorraine, to feel her story. "We spend so much time chasing knowledge," he said. "But we forget that wisdom comes from moments like that. Moments when someone shows you what matters not with words, but with their life." Lorraine Carter didn't just change a law. She changed me. And if that's not education, I don't know what is. He paused, his hands steady, his gaze unwavering. The gala, for all its grandeur, felt small in the face of that truth, and the room waited, knowing Kennedy's story was building towards something even greater. The New York Metropolitan Arts Hall was a cathedral of silence, its opulent chandeliers casting a soft glow over a crowd transformed. Senator John Neely Kennedy stood at the podium, his presence a quiet force, his Louisiana drawl weaving stories that had turned Adam Schiff's earlier mockery, Uneducated, into a distant echo. The gala, once a stage for elite posturing, had become a sanctuary for truth. Each of Kennedy's tales, Miss Clara Boone's schoolhouse, the unsung wisdom of Henry Evelyn and Amos, and Lorraine Carter's Senate plea, building a case for an education rooted in life, not credentials. The audience, draped in tuxedos and gowns, sat in rapt attention, their earlier amusement replaced by a reverence that felt almost sacred. Kennedy's hands rested lightly on the podium, his eyes scanning the room not for validation but for connection. He took a slow breath, his voice steady, warm, and deliberate. "Adam," he said, addressing Schiff directly, but with a gentleness that carried no malice, "you've heard my stories. But there's one more I need to share, a lesson that ties them all together. It's about a friend who taught me what education is really for." Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his voice softening, as if confiding a secret. "When I was a boy in Louisiana, I had a friend named Tommy Reed. He wasn't the kind of kid who stood out, no trophies, no report cards with gold stars. Tommy's family was poor, poorer than mine, and that's saying something. They lived in a house with a tin roof that rattled in the wind, and most days Tommy wore the same shirt faded from too many washes. But he had this light in him, a kindness that didn't make sense for someone who had so little. I remember one summer, I was maybe 12, and I'd saved up $1 to buy a soda at the general store, a big deal back then. Tommy was with me, but he didn't have a cent. When we got to the counter, I saw him eyeing that soda, but he didn't say a word. So I split it with him, half and half, right there on the store steps. He looked at me like I'd given him the moon, and he said, "One day I'm going to pay you back, John. Not with money, but with something better." Kennedy's voice caught just for a moment, and he smiled, the memory vivid in his eyes. The room was still the clink of glasses and rustle of silk, long forgotten. Kennedy continued, his voice rich with warmth. Tommy wasn't much for school, dropped out at 16 to work helping his mama keep the lights on. But he had a way of seeing people, really seeing them. I'd watch him give his lunch to a kid who was hungry or spend an hour fixing a neighbor's fence, no payment asked. Once a stray dog showed up in town half-starved, and Tommy spent a week coaxing it with scraps until it followed him home. He didn't have much, but what he had, he gave. And every time he'd say, "This is my payback, John. This is what I meant." Kennedy paused, his hands clasping together, his gaze sweeping the crowd. Tommy didn't read big books or know fancy words, but he taught me something I've carried my whole life. Education isn't about what you keep for yourself. It's about what you build for others. The audience leaned in their faces, a mix of emotion, some nodding, others visibly moved. Kennedy's voice grew quieter, but its weight filled the hall. Tommy's life wasn't easy. He worked odd jobs, cutting grass, hauling lumber, whatever kept his family afloat. But he never lost that light. I'd see him around town, always with a smile, always with a hand out to help. One winter, when I was home from college, I ran into him at the church. He was dropping off a box of canned goods for a family that had lost everything in a fire. I asked him how he could afford it working the hours he did. He just shrugged and said, "You don't afford kindness, John. You make room for it." And that stuck with me deeper than any lecture I'd heard in a classroom. Kennedy's eyes glistened, but his voice stayed steady, each word landing like a stone in still water. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Adam Schiff at the edge of the stage. Schiff stood motionless, his earlier confidence dimmed, his arms uncrossed now, hands at his sides. Kennedy didn't linger on him. Instead, he faced the crowd, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. Tommy passed away, young, too young. Heart gave out one summer working in the heat. I was a lawyer by then, starting to make my way, but his funeral stopped me cold. The church was packed, not with important folks, but with people like him, neighbors, workers, kids he'd helped. They told stories about Tommy fixing their roofs, sharing his supper, teaching their boys how to fish. And I realized something standing there in that pew. Tommy Reed, with no degree, no title, had educated a whole town in what it means to live right. He didn't have a podium or a spotlight, but his life was a lesson written in every small good thing he did. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that follows a truth too big for words. Kennedy leaned forward, his hands resting on the podium, his voice a blend of resolve and reverence. "Adam, you called me uneducated, and maybe, by your measure, I am. I don't have the polish or the pedigree some folks do. But I've been taught by people like Tommy, who showed me that education isn't a trophy you hang on the wall. It's a tool, a hammer to build a light, to share a hand, to lift someone else up. And if we're not using it that way, then all our learning's just noise." He paused, letting the words settle, and the crowd stirred, a soft murmur of agreement rippling through the room. Kennedy's gaze swept the audience, his eyes moving from face to face, as if inviting them to see Tommy, to feel his story. "We've got a habit in this country," he said, "of measuring people by what they've got. Degrees, titles, bank accounts. But I've learned that the real measure is what you give." Tommy gave everything, not because he had to, but because he believed that's what a life's for. And that's the education I'm talking about, not the kind that makes you loud, but the kind that makes you useful. The kind that makes you show up, even when the world's telling you to stay home. His voice softened, almost a whisper. I've sat in rooms with powerful people who couldn't muster half the wisdom Tommy carried in his work boots. And if that's what it means to be uneducated, then I'm proud to wear the label. The room seemed to exhale the tension of Schiff's earlier jab, dissolving into something warmer, more human. Kennedy took a slow breath, his hand steady on the podium. "Let me leave you with this," he said, his voice rising just enough to command the hall. "Education isn't about knowing more than the next man. It's about doing more with what you know. It's about listening to the Miss Claras, the Henrys, the Evelyns, the Lorraines, the Tommies, the people who teach us not with words but with their lives. And it's about taking those lessons and building something better, a community, a family, a world that remembers what matters." He paused, his eyes finding Schiff one last time, not with anger but with a quiet challenge. "So Adam, if you want to call me uneducated, that's fine, but don't mistake silence for ignorance. Some of us only speak when we've got something worth saying." The silence that followed was profound, a shared moment of recognition. Then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, then joined by another and another, until the sound swelled into a tide of applause rising like a storm. The crowd stood, their faces alight with emotion, not for Kennedy the politician, but for Kennedy the witness, the man who'd turned an insult into a mirror. Schiff remained still, his eyes fixed on Kennedy, his expression unreadable but softened, as if grappling with the weight of what he'd heard. Kennedy didn't bask in the moment. He stepped back from the podium, his head bowed slightly, and murmured something under his breath, too soft for the microphones to catch. Then, with a nod to the crowd, he walked off the stage, his steps unhurried, his presence lingering like a promise kept. The applause continued, a thunderous affirmation of the lessons Kennedy had shared. The gala, for all its grandeur, had been redefined not by wealth or status, but by stories of ordinary people who'd taught a senator what it means to be truly educated. The final lesson was clear. Education is not a destination, but a lifelong act of learning, giving, and growing. It's a call to look beyond titles, to listen to the quiet voices, and to live with a heart open to the lessons life offers. For the audience, the message was a challenge to carry those lessons forward, to build with humility, and to honor the Tommies of the world, whose lives, though small in the eyes of some, hold the power to change everything.